Good evening, everybody, and it's nice to see you modelling student behaviour and filling from the back. My name's Rob Mortimer, I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and International. I'm delighted to welcome you to this inaugural lecture this evening by Professor Richard Bourne. I will start with just a little intro, a little bio. Richard has a hat-trick of degrees from the University of Exeter, BA, MA and PhD, where he developed specialisms in ethics and political theology. He's taught at a wide range of places, and he's taught a wide range of subjects in those places. So he's taught from Cambridge to Lancaster, to Durham, to Cumbria, to Leeds Trinity, and now York St John. His research is interdisciplinary, and he often puts theological ethics into dialogue with other disciplines, sometimes obvious bedfellows like philosophy, and sometimes not so obvious bedfellows like criminology. His current research is on the theological ethics of criminal punishment and political theory, political theology of the arts. My brain's been in geochemistry all afternoon, it's not easy, this transition. Richard joined York St John in 2015 as head of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies and became head of School of Humanities in 2016. When this lecture was organised, he'd just been promoted to professor, but since then he has become Pro-Vice Chancellor for Education as well. Richard's external work includes a range of things, including the Society for the Study of Christian Ethics, EDI advisory work for Advance HE, and he's also a trustee of York City of Sanctuary. So tonight he is going to give us a lecture on theological ethics and transformation. Richard.
Thank you, Rob. I've got lots of questions. And here's the first one. How on earth did I get here? I guess I'm in my mid-40s, so a bit of midlife crisis, a little bit of retrospection, not unusual. Having to write an inaugural lecture may bring on a bit more biographical self-indulgence, so I'm going to begin with a little bit of that. But honestly, if you'd asked me when I was growing up what I would be, an academic, let alone a professor, would have been a very, very long way down the list. In fact, I don't think I would have known what list to put it on. Depending on when you'd asked me, I might have said a vet, a chef, a gardener, a police officer, serve in the RAF, a social worker, or a lawyer, but only in criminal or human rights law. Our expectations and our ambitions are shaped by our family, and the Bournes were a pretty varied lot. Excluding some of the less respectable moments in the deep and distant past, we've had farmers, gardeners, a musician, a watercolourist, a graphic designer, an HR consultant, and 2 generations ago, a very strong sense of the RAF as the family service. But what wasn't in the mix was graduates. University wasn't all that much understood. It wasn't part of the world we inhabited. In that sense, it's quite a journey, to use the current language of widening participation, from first in family, eligible for free school meals, to university professor, and now PDC. It's a journey I know I'm not alone in taking, and that is one of the many transformative things about university. But it's humbling to look back and to think of the people who sustained me and supported me in that journey. So I owe a great deal of thanks to friends and to colleagues, many of whom are here tonight, who've energised me in my work, often through pub conversations or a chat over coffee. Those who taught me, the teachers who inspired me, or perhaps even that teacher who never really turned up very much and therefore helped me to create habits of self-discipline and independent study. That's not a pedagogy I recommend. In particular, I think thanks to my students, past and present, who I've learned from, who I've had the privilege of teaching, and who I'll say a little bit more about later. In particular, though, thanks to my wife, Kristen, and my daughter, Ella, both of whom are here tonight. And to my son, Josiah, who isn't here tonight, because he's currently in the middle of his own transformative experience of education. He's, hopefully not now in the dark, but he's been canoeing, climbing, abseiling at Bewley Park in Nidderdale. Kristen, Ella and Josiah, thank you. Your encouragement, your patience, your humour has sustained me in ways I can never express, and I couldn't carry on this lecture without saying that. I'm thinking about my son right now at Bewley Park. He's going to come back tomorrow. He's going to be exhausted. It's going to be muddy. He's going to be in desperate need of a shower. I hope he'll also come back, though, enthused, bold, confident in his own ability to overcome challenges, his ability to help others, and to be helped in return. What he's experiencing is outdoor learning. That's one part of what a transformative education can look like. It can take place in many locations, in many ways, and there isn't a set prescription or a process for it. Often, it's quite deeply personal. Not all of the outcomes are immediately visible. I'm sure as I'm talking, you might even be bringing to mind your own moments and memories of transformative education. Something that motivates you when you teach, something that you carry with you. What questions you had, what it felt like when you realised you had potential. What transformative education looked like for you. In the West, of course, we're very focused on construing knowledge and education through metaphors of vision, what it looks like. I can tell you, for me though, not just what transformative education looks like, but what it smells like. For me, it smells like the warm mustiness of a large greenhouse, often mixed with the sweet smoke of Hamlet cigars, or the smell of fresh picked tomatoes in the farm shop. If you want a little quiz as we're going through this, this is me and my twin brother on the left-hand side. You can tell me later which one you think I am. So all of that is because I spent a deal of my time as a young child with my grandparents. And my granddad, Jim, here was a gardener. He served as a gardener and then as head gardener at various farm estates in the Surrey Hills. He always had students on placement, often from Waterperry Women's Horticultural College, and then here in his last role, teaching horticulture to ex-merchant seamen. Something of that has stayed with me. Something of that potential for education to give second chances, or even first real chances. It may be one of the reasons why, no matter what job I do, I can't really stop teaching. The reason I became a theologian, though, rather than any of that other long list of things I gave you earlier, has a lot to do with my temperament and my background. You don't really get to choose where you grow up, and I grew up in a relatively theologically conservative evangelical church. Much of its theology and its practice did not sit easy with me. The compulsory extroversion, the often right-wing politics, youth groups with an obsession with sex and purity culture. To put it mildly, that meant I had questions. In fact, having questions is what got me into theology. The faith background I grew up in was a contradictory mixture of anti-intellectualism on the one hand, and some honourable exceptions who, within that faith tradition, were seeking to be rigorous in their thinking. And I value that, even though I've not landed anywhere near where those people do theologically. So doing theology for me started as a way of pushing back. You might say it's part of my teenage rebellion. It's a fairly muted form of rebellion, I know, but I did do little bits of purifying as well. Doing theology at university was, pun intended, a revelation. So much more diversity of thought, so many different perspectives and arguments. I quickly discovered that doing theology means that you never run out of questions. There is no end point, and I love that. University education doesn't actually often give you definitive answers, but it's a great training in patiently living with questions. So what I want to do in this lecture is just tell you a little bit about some of the questions that I've had, just to scratch the surface on those. And actually, sitting down and writing this lecture gave me a moment to discover something new. I didn't think I had themes running through my research, but it looks like I do. In particular, the nature of transformation. Whether it's about the possibility of political change, the change of moral character, the change of behaviour, an experience of personal transformation. My explorations have intertwined two different philosophical and theological accounts of change. On the one hand, the gradual acquisition of virtue, whether moral or intellectual. That occurs through habituation, theologians speak. It's a form of ethics known as virtue ethics, for which the fundamental consideration of ethics isn't our isolated actions or decisions. It's not our duties, and it's not the consequences of our actions, important as each and all of those are. More fundamentally, it's about our character, about something we develop, or actually something that develops us. Virtues or vices are cultivated through repetition and training. Aristotle famously describes moral virtues as habits of right action formed by acting rightly. That is to say, we aim at human excellence, at flourishing, fundamentally through practice. At the turn of the 20th century, Will Durant, another philosopher, stated it this way: we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence is not an act, but a habit. If that's true, it's a habit that takes more than individual effort, and more than heroic self-discipline. It takes community, accountability, support, mentorship, and a good dose of forgiveness, both of yourself and others. In theological traditions, that acquisition of virtue, moral, intellectual, or theological, is a combination of human action and divine grace, and sanctification. But secondly, that habituation is not linear or stable. Christian accounts of change also articulate the dramatic moment, the conversion event on the road to Damascus. The apocalypsis, literally the unveiling, the apocalypse. After all, Christianity is a religion that draws its identity from the event of the incarnation, the death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And the claim that in that, God is dramatically identifying with humanity, that the divine is breaking into the human history, is setting it right. So it's an account of history as dramatically interrupted, a deliberate fracturing of progressive linear time by moments and fragments of grace. Kairos and chronos, the two Greek words for those different types of time. While in popular culture, apocalyptic is understood to be about destruction, fire, torment, the narrative structure of most apocalypses, both biblical ones and recent apocalyptic fiction as well, tend to focus not on destruction, but on disjunction. There's always a faithful remnant, a group of witnesses, a group that is persecuted who are promised hope and deliverance in the end. But that's not merely the continuation of the same historical trajectory. Apocalypse is interruptive. It brings to view the surprise, the event, the novum. So in contrast with gradual, linear, progressive time, that so-called messianic time does what the theologian John Caputo describes as being divested of the guiding light of the future present. What he means by that is that we lose that guiding light, we lose that thing that we thought was certain in the future. The way things are is not necessarily the way things have to be. But why do I think that theology has anything useful to contribute to politics in the first place? When I tell somebody I'm a theologian, they often ask me if I want to be a vicar. I don't. When I say I'm a political theologian, they're often either surprised there is such a thing, or they simply edge away, change the subject uncomfortably. Religion and politics are, of course, famously not topics for polite conversation. But one of the great things about universities is that they can enable respectful and civil ways of having impolite conversations, conversations that unsettle us. So my doctoral thesis and my first book, I will plug my books by the way, sought to extend and critique forms of political theology associated with Stanley Hauerwas at Duke University and John Howard Yoder, the Mennonite theologian who inspired him. I'll say in a second why I came to regret that. But they are influential theologians in the 20th century in terms of the relationship between theology and politics, and they drew their inspiration from the radical Reformation of the 16th century, from the Anabaptists, who held, for example, to believers' baptism rather than infant baptism, to the absolute separation of church and state, largely for the benefit of the church, to not be sullied by the works of state, and to a commitment to non-violence. That had led some wings of the Anabaptists to a radical separation from the world. And those are the forms that we are perhaps most familiar with, the Amish and certain forms of Mennonite separatist communities. But underneath that, the grounding theological commitment of that tradition is what theologians refer to as a Christocentric picture of God. Theologians love a bit of jargon. All they mean by that is that God is through and through what you see in Jesus. In other words, God is non-violent, patient, forgiving, and reconciling. For these writers, though, the gospel then is inherently political, but to do justice to that claim, it has to be understood specifically as a commitment to non-violent politics. And that's never been an easy distinction for the church to maintain. Christianity has often thought of itself as the possessor of an immutable truth. And once it's thought that, then it's decided, well, if we possess the truth, we must make history come out right. And the best way of doing that is to take up the way of violence. Even that invocation of forgiveness can easily and tragically slip into abuse. That's true within the Anabaptist communities and others where victims of domestic abuse or child sexual abuse have been told to forgive. The duty is to forgive, and that has silenced them against their perpetrators. I said a minute ago that I came to regret my choice of focus in my PhD thesis, and here's why. After I wrote it, the theologian John Howard Yoder was discovered to have been espousing, on the one hand, repentance as a key Christian practice, whilst on the other hand, being an unrepentant sexual abuser of women in his church. He espoused non-violence, he rejected war, but he physically assaulted women in his church too. That is shameful, and theology is not a discourse where you can easily separate personal morality from academic message. So I don't tend to talk about Yoder that much anymore. I dig into the traditions that he was just one advocate of instead. My first book, though, already sought to go beyond that tradition of political theology by putting it into dialogue with political theory. In particular, to explore what politics means for the commitment to non-violence that I spoke about earlier. Politics isn't just about what states do, and that means we can't rest content with the modern separation of a public realm on the one hand, of politics, economy, statecraft, and on the other hand, a private realm of things like religion and art, both of which I think are inherently political. And I'll come back to art a little bit later. Indeed, looking back, much of what I've been concerned with is pushing back on that privatization of some forms of politics. For many, though, the notion of politics and religion mixing evokes fear. Fear of violence, fear of theocracy, or intolerance. In popular discourse, especially in the media, religion intervenes in violence. It imposes one worldview on others. If you think about, for example, the way that contemporary Christian nationalists in North America will pray at Trump rallies for the salvific purposes of Donald Trump, you may get one sense of the kinds of dynamic that I'm referring to there. That is problematic stuff. But once that's terrible, it doesn't mean that we can simply portray religion's political concerns as an imposition of one group's preferences. Behind that objection often lies a norm about what theology and religion should, and in particular should not, get involved in. It may seem obvious to some of you, actually, that religion is a matter of private preference and should be kept out of politics. So what I did in that book was to explore some of the political, theoretical constructs of the nature of public political debate. In particular, I looked at people like Jürgen Habermas and John Rawls, who both argued in slightly different ways that religious contributions to public debates needed to be shorn of all religious language. They needed to be translated into secular, neutral language instead. I dispute the notion that secular and neutral mean the same thing. But what they envisaged was a kind of public ethical debate, a public political debate, as a neutral space where you didn't get to talk about your own particular traditions, your own perspectives, your own background, your own arguments. And of course, the first problem with that is that it runs the risk of removing from public debate the things that actually help us make sense of our lives. Alistair MacIntyre, the philosopher, suggested that that kind of thing would be analogous to taking stories away from children. Deprive children of stories, he says, and you leave them unscripted, anxious stutterers in their actions as in their words. In other words, our stories enable our actions. One of the other problems with that kind of approach, Rawls and Habermas, is that it isn't actually how public ethical debate works. Civil society is far more complicated and far more pragmatic than that. Merely invoking religion can, of course, be a conversation stopper. It is a terrible argument to state, as some do, that we shouldn't have provision for legal abortion because I know God said so. That's not going to persuade somebody who doesn't believe in God. But it's also not going to persuade somebody who does believe in God and thinks we should have legal routes to abortion. The issue with that is not that it's religious argumentation, but that it's bad religious argumentation. We don't regard Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches as a defective form of public ethical intervention just because he drew heavily on Christian preaching and scriptures. If somebody argues in favour of rescuing asylum seekers from drowning in the Channel, as I hope we all would, that's appropriate. But if they frame that as being faithful to a divine injunction to protect the vulnerable, to offer hospitality and sanctuary, if they appeal to biblical scriptures, for example, in expressing why they think that's important, have they failed in their articulation of their reasons? Does that not make sense to us? What they've chosen is a particular way of expressing a shared social value of compassion. So instead of a kind of neutral zone of departicularized statements, translated statements, all I did was to outline there a kind of model of public debate as a much more pragmatic space of open, critical encounter between different worldviews. For all members of society, no matter what their faith position, no matter what the tradition is that they come from, we don't make public life better by bracketing, deleting, or downplaying the diverse and particular reasons why we believe and act as we do. What we need are practices of sustaining and seeking the good in common with one another. And we value, therefore, our particularity and should avoid unnecessary abstraction. Actually, a great deal of the rest of my career has been spent trying to avoid unnecessary abstraction. And that may seem an odd thing for a theologian to say, because after all, isn't theology essentially abstract? A meditation on the nature of divine being, metaphysics. But big ideas don't have to be abstract. In fact, I think they never really are. Big ideas have big impact. But we can sometimes miss that because those ideas remain unexamined. They can be part of the air we breathe. They can be the things we just take for granted as obvious. And one of the great things about university education is the obvious becomes problematic. And that makes it far more unsettling, more strange when we encounter a different set of big ideas. Now, I've taught Christian doctrine for the best part of 20 years. And I confess I started out doing that exactly the same way that I was taught. A big historical sweep of the development of Christian doctrine from the 1st century onwards. A reflection on the doctrine of the Trinity. Is it a hierarchy or is it a community? A metaphysical puzzle of how divine and human can be united together in the incarnation. But honestly, I found my students to be just utterly bemused by that. It made theology much more about impossible mathematics, being 1 and 3 at the same time, than it was about claims of meaning, truth, goodness, or beauty. I remember only too well, very early in my teaching career, the utter futility of walking into a group of 30 or so would-be primary RE teachers and explaining to them the finer points of 19th century canonical accounts of the incarnation. They did not see the point, and they had a point in that. So, a couple of years ago, I co-wrote a textbook with a really good friend of mine, Dr. Imogen Adkins, which sought to capture some of the ways we'd developed of emphasizing not abstraction, but embodiment and experience. Instead of treating each doctrine as a discrete chapter, as more or less every theology textbook does. Instead, we began with a foundational commitment to the embodied nature of knowing. It pursues, as you can see from the structure, 5 chapters on theology and the arts through the senses, at a strong emphasis on a much more positive depiction of bodily experience in Christianity than many realise is there. It then had 2 other chapters on fundamental human activities, on loving and resting. Now, the title, as you can see on the screen, is simply a new introduction to theology, embodiment, experience, and encounter. We'd wanted to call it full-bodied theology, largely because neither Imogen nor I can resist a good pun, and we couldn't quite get away from the notion of something being both fully embodied and full of flavour. Our publisher had other ideas. They were probably right from a strictly marketing point of view, but I still can't quite get over losing the pun. The book begins, though, with an account of seeing and of human knowledge as akin to an encounter with great literature, film, or theatre. It argues throughout that imagination is central to theological forms of knowing. We explored music to help make sense of doctrine of the Trinity. So instead of spatial metaphors of 3 and 1 competing for space, or mathematical puzzles, we instead explored the kind of complementarity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit through ideas of harmonic resonance, chords. We even actually at one point provided a recommended listening list, which ranged from the sublime to the ridiculous to the genuinely terrible. So from Handel to Thomas Tallis, to ABBA, and even to Hanson's Mbop. No one was expecting that tonight, were they? Apologies to anyone who now has that running through their head. If you haven't, and don't remember what it sounds like, Google it when you get home and thank me later, or not. For touch, we explored the nature of human desire, the possibility of a positive valuation of sexual diversity in Christianity, and surveying some of the various challenges and some of the problematic readings of key biblical passages taken to refer to sexual identities. For tasting, we introduced students to a theology of sacraments through an extended reflection on the ways that we're all implicated in food supply chains, the ethics of food production, how savouring food evokes memory, and how eating together creates community. I won't spoil the surprise, but don't worry, there's copies in the library if you really want to find out what a theology of smelling sounds like and looks like. The pedagogically minded among you will spot that the underpinnings of that sit well with David Kolb's experiential learning cycle to a degree. I disagree with him, I think, on that distinction between thinking and feeling that he tends to draw. But what we did is to ally that with a sense of embodied knowledge, and in particular of both art and religion and politics, as exercises of imagination. And the exercise of imagination, I suggest, is central to a theology of political change. Politics is fundamentally about meaning, about identity, about belonging, and therein lies its imaginative roots. Benedict Anderson very famously describes contemporary national identities as imagined communities. Imagination positions individuals in frameworks of wider meaning and purpose. Indeed, imagination is not just how we make sense of the world, it is how we make it. In a publication so recent that it's still been worked on by the editors, in fact I had an email this morning, I've begun to theorize just a little bit about the relationship between politics, theology, and art. A number of philosophers in recent years have begun to explore how art has within it an inherent call to justice. Elaine Scarry insists that the contemplation of art is not an abstraction from the call to justice at all. It is rather, she says, at the moment that we see something beautiful, that we undergo a radical decentering. I think that might be a little bit too simplistic. It's not necessarily the case that every experience of art calls us to justice. That's more contingent on the particular political conditions in which that art occurs and is viewed or consumed. Importantly, though, the way I think art is political is that it doesn't give us so much a worked-out policy agenda. What it does, if we follow Jacques Rancière's influential account, is it gives us an aesthetic break, a dislocation that occurs in artistic practice. So think for a minute about a piece of music, a theatrical performance, a piece of art that has stopped you in your tracks. Something that surprised you. So I put two up on the screen. The first was me walking through London in 2007, many of you may have seen this, and coming across Anthony Gormley's event Horizon. 31 life-size figures scattered around central London, mostly on rooftops. And they were situated in such a way as to evoke simultaneously how busy we are and yet also our solitude. Or Chiharu Shiota's Beyond Time at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park in 2018 in the 18th century chapel there. It sought to demonstrate the interconnections between us and previous generations, the accumulated memory of past generations, those white threads coming from that piano representing both purity and death, white of course being a colour of mourning in Japan, but also renewal. Now I highlight those two just because they are, for me, things that stopped me in my tracks. So, for Jacques Rancière then, the political impact of aesthetic experience is fundamentally an interruption, but it's not an abstraction. Art knocks us off balance. It punctuates the mundane order. It is, and I know this is a dense phrase, it is a multiplicity of fold and gaps in the fabric of common experience that change the cartography of the perceptible, the thinkable, and the feasible. And as such, it allows for new modes of political construction of common objects and new possibilities of collective enunciation. A change in what is perceptible, what we can see, what is thinkable, what's even possible. That's what imagination and art can do. For the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, he focuses much more on the experience of contemplation, and that can be artistic or philosophical. And what he says is that contemplation is the properly human praxis, the fundamental activity of being human, which he says by rendering inoperative the specific works and functions of living being, makes them run on idle, and in that way opens them to new possibilities. There's something quite appealing about that surprise, that shock, that memorable moment. But the danger, I think, in it is that it fails to intertwine those two different accounts of change. what's mundane, boring, habitual, but actually gets stuff done, and what is, nonetheless, an impactful, surprising event. How do we combine those two? Agamben's quite interesting. He tends to draw a lot on theological genealogies of modern ideas. So he talks about Sabbath, he talks about grace, he talks about a Franciscan concept of use of property as opposed to ownership of property. But by far his most frequent invocation is from Herman Melville's short story, Bartleby the Scrivener. Bartleby is a scrivener, a scribe, in a Wall Street law firm. And it doesn't matter if it's his colleague or his line manager, for every request, and it doesn't matter how reasonable, how much it would help Bartleby himself, he responds the same way. I would prefer not to. And for Agamben, that refusal strips back to pure potentiality. It gives us a moment to do something completely different. But if I can just address one member of the audience for a second. Ella, don't go getting any ideas tonight. When I tell you to go to bed, please do not respond with, I would prefer not to. You see, Agamben tends to favour examples of complete negation over sustainable practices of living differently. His image of change is one sustained more often by individual, often borderline tragic figures, rather than sustainable collective cooperation for change. And of course, if you haven't read it, Bartleby eventually starves himself to death. It is a good story, despite that ending. By contrast, though, when we model artistic moments of dissociation as a form of contemplation, what I suggest is that we would do well to remember that religious contemplation, including but not just Christian practices of contemplative prayer or mystical experience, aren't figured as an escape. They're not an escape from materiality into apathetic purity, at least not always. Sometimes they're understood more as an intensification and a purification of desire and of bodily experience. So not permanent detachment, but a temporary, intense disconnect that allows us to return anew to the world. They don't enclose us from one another, but generate the imaginative impetus and the empathy required to effect change. Another way that transformation happens, though, is that it helps us to see our present and our past in a new light. For good or for ill, contemporary political practices bear the marks of previous generations' theological commitments. The German jurist Carl Schmitt very famously said that all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secular theological concepts. So, for example, contemporary accounts of the politics of sovereignty, contemporary models of the nature of political power, come from previous centuries' imaginings of the nature of divine power. For Schmitt, that meant that absolute divine power to click your fingers and achieve whatever you want models itself in fascist forms of politics. Now, one of the most sustained themes in my work in recent years, though, has been to seek to construct an account of personal transformation and criminal punishment. Much of the contemporary ethical justification of criminal punishment is retributivist. That is to say, we justify punishment fundamentally because it's right, indeed it's necessary, that we revisit on the offender something of the harm they have done to others. The Code of Hammurabi puts this first and then echoes through various scriptures, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Not necessarily that then the punishment has to resemble the crime, but it has to symbolically pay people back. But the currency of that payment is pain, hard treatment. The influence of that kind of commitment stems certainly in a country, in a nation, in a culture that owes a great deal to its Christian theological past, It flows from a particular account of the death of Christ, what theologians call a theology of the atonement, often referred to in shorthand as penal substitution, that Christ takes on our punishment, is the substitute for those who sin. That has a long and complex history, which I won't go into tonight, you'll be pleased to know. Probably starting with Anselm in the 11th century, I think more prominently about punishment by the time we get to the 16th century. But essentially it's a set of views that regards the death of Christ as salvific. Not the resurrection, but the experience of death. So that death on the cross is said to express the wrath of God. That wrath must be satisfied to balance the dishonour or the offence done to God in sin. That creates for them and for us, I think, a culture in which pain and hard treatment aren't just the natural consequences of wrongdoing, they are redemptive. Pain itself becomes that which pays for salvation. And of course, if that's how God is said to deal with sin, then that becomes how states view their role in relation to criminal behaviour too. So punishment is fundamentally about revisiting suffering on the offender. Now, behind every justification of punishment is a picture of what it is to be good and evil, an account of moral agency. Behind retributive accounts of punishment, very often, I think, is a very limited rationalist account of moral agency. That is to say, you fundamentally understand going wrong in life, making a mistake, as a matter of miscalculation. You have miscalculated the costs and benefits of your chosen path. The job of punishment, therefore, is to balance out the moral scale by expressing in pain the message that crime doesn't pay. But I think actually that is a terribly limited account of the nature of moral wrongdoing. I've argued then that it fails to account for the fact that human actions, and probably criminal behaviour in particular, are rarely rationally chosen. They're often not planned, and they're certainly not simply comparable to simple objective calculation. Instead, then, I've suggested the need to be attentive to the affective dimension of criminal behaviour, and the way that models of penance in the Christian tradition sought to not just educate the mind, but to shape and educate desire, affect, emotion. So for the first time, I think, I put theology into dialogue with a movement in criminology called cultural criminology, which focuses on the emotional experiences of crime. Crime as a means of self-expression, as a means of perceived revolt against the mundane banality of late modern urban culture. The prevalence of anomie, frustration, exclusion, and alienation in urban poverty, which generates, for example, an exaggerated, often violent performance of masculinity. And that violence then locks young men into an excluded space with no second chance. In that respect, then, the prevalence of a kind of retributive account of punishment in our society and in our theologies quite often has obscured a much more restorative model in Christianity, and I think a model that is useful in rethinking the ethics of punishment. Of course, there's always been religious influence on that side of criminal punishment too. Think of jails modelled on monastic cells. Think of solitude valorised as a kind of character-forming, prayerful introspection. Solitary confinement is rarely experienced that way. But in my work, what I've done is to suggest an alternative theological vision for punishment as penance. But penance not as self-flagellation, not as beating yourself up, but as a kind of structured development of habits that reshape desire and action through penitent acts, including engagement with forms and practices of restorative justice. And the kind of moral anthropology, the philosophy, the picture of human action underlying that understands our plasticity. That is to say, that our desires, our behaviours are liable to change and formation. When you get rid of that kind of retributive framing of punishment, penance can be positively understood, I think, as a supported communal practice of reshaping desire, attitude, and action. It's an invitation, not an imposition. That ties quite nicely in with some recent criminological studies of the nature of desistance. I'm thinking of Shag Maruna's Good Lives model, which focuses on what he calls the redeemability of ex-offenders and the importance of supporting and empowering them to, in his words, rewrite their personal narratives. So just some snapshots, just scratching the surface of some of the things I've explored. But I did say that I'd give some reflections on how a theologian might account for the transformative power of higher education. I've given some indications, I think, of the nature of transformation that intertwines both virtue and apocalypse, habit and surprise. That motif of writing or rewriting our stories seems appropriate. But notice the plural, stories, not story. Nothing, I think, in what I've said so far falls too much into a kind of individualistic picture. The heroic picture of the lone intellectual crusader is largely an academic myth. The virtues of academic life are not fundamentally an individual possession. They're a communal experience. And they're shaped by habits of criticality, disputation, and rigorous seeking of evidence. It doesn't really matter what our disciplinary identities are, and there's all sorts of different disciplines represented here tonight. We all draw insights from one another. We critique one another. Sometimes we dismiss one another. Very occasionally we might ridicule one another, but that breaks one of those fundamental community rules of academia of respectful inquiry. And that's also the case for interdisciplinary work as well. What unites us in our academic work isn't the route, it's not the method, it's not the discipline, or the politics, but it's certain shared values, contested concepts, and transformative practices. You see, I think higher education develops in us all, staff and students alike, habits of greater nuance, care, and focus on evidence. It allows us to practice those habits of rigour in argumentation, openness in our feedback to one another, and to living with questions and to disagreeing well. But also, I think, like art or religion, education is also defined by its ability to surprise, to give us a new way of seeing things. It's a form of surprise that leads us back together because it creates empathy. Each academic discipline is far more than an established body of knowledge. It's an ongoing argument, a way of seeing, indeed a way of being in the world that our graduates carry with them once they leave us. Among its many benefits and many effects, higher education provides graduates and society as a whole with a critical, creative, and capacious imagination. And it's an absolute privilege to play a small part in that. So thank you for listening to some of the questions I've lived with, and I hope they've given you some questions too.
Thanks, Richard. That was really interesting, and it really reminds me why I love these inaugural lectures so much. We have such a variety of disciplines on this campus, and we can come and listen to a completely different perspective, completely different discipline to our own. So thank you for that. Time for some questions, hopefully. There's some roving mics. Hopefully there will be some questions, otherwise I'll have to ask the burning question about the picture with the small children at the beginning. You stunned them into silence. Yes, question in front.
So, I'm coming at this from a forensic psychological, I'm coming at it from a forensic psychological perspective, but given that our attitude towards crime and punishment is dominated by a sort of punish them, sort of thing,
Yeah.
and it's ineffective. How do we change the social dialogue to be one that's more effective? If you have thoughts.
That's easy stuff.
Just a small one to start with, yeah. I think the short answer is you're right. What we currently do doesn't work. We've got, what, 80-odd thousand prisoners in England and Wales, mostly in the male estate. I think 3,000 or 4,000 in the female estate currently. Desistance levels are very, very low. I think the problem is that we know it doesn't work, but we also know that the kind of political rhetoric that we see draws on exactly that theological inheritance I'm talking about. It makes a lot of sense to say an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That reciprocity is instinctively something that we value. The problem theologically, actually, is that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth doesn't necessarily mean an injunction. It doesn't mean for every eye you lose, you must take an eye, and every tooth you lose, you must take a tooth. It's more likely, I think, to be a constraint. So if somebody takes my eye, I'm darn well going to want to take their eye, their tooth, their arm, and everything else. But actually I can't. I've got to restrain it to something proportionate. And that's a very different kind of theology, to say that we're aware of that kind of cycle of vengeance and violence. Theologically, you then also have to deal with the fact that the Sermon on the Mount says quite clearly, you say an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, forgive those who persecute you, and so on. So there's a different kind of theological reading in that too. How do we get somewhere good from where we are? I think we probably start from the other end of it. I think it's going to be very difficult to unsettle a social sentiment that says that criminals deserve to suffer. There are three levels of desistance in the kind of good lives model. So there's individual desistance, primary desistance, which is just stopping offending. There's secondary desistance, which is about the habits of that to make sure that the individual isn't going to offend in future. But then there's tertiary desistance, which is more about social reintegration. And that seems to me the bit that we are utterly awful at. We don't have rituals, practices, or investment to allow that to happen. But actually, education is one of the ways in which that can happen. So it's not going to solve it, but one part of that might be better prisoner education.
So, Ernestine over here.
Thank you, Richard. It was good to hear that one of the things you talked about when you were younger was to be a lawyer and looking particularly at criminal law or human rights. Now, bringing those two into, or putting it into context, so criminal law is about punishing criminals, and human rights is also talking about respecting the human rights of others. And the big question is, to what extent can punishing criminals have an impact on the human rights? And then I'm wondering where, in terms of your theological ethics and studies, where that sits in between these two, in terms of human rights and criminal law and theological ethics.
Good question. I think that a lot of our practice in criminal punishment actually strays very close to breaching human rights. I think that we've got the wrong balance between those two. And I think the practices of restorative justice change that balance. I don't know, I've got a lot more to say than that. I think the idea that criminal law is fundamentally about retributive punishment, I think may need some reform, because criminal law should fundamentally be about social accountability for offences, but social accountability for offences doesn't necessarily mean retribution. So I would certainly advocate, for example, for a very significant reduction in imprisonment. There might be arguments for public protection reasons for imprisonment, but quite a lot of what we currently have doesn't serve that function.
Thanks. I think there's a question right at the back. Yep.
Thank you. situated your discussion of religion very squarely in a Judeo-Christian context. But we are a country now of many religions. What impact does that have on your thinking and on your ideas?
Really good question. Fundamentally, I think one of the things that's worth appreciating about the particular Christian traditions that I discussed, the Radical Reformation, the Anabaptists, is they were always a minority. They were never trying to use the levers of Christian establishment to achieve their ends. In fact, they thought any time you did that, any time Christians and the church became involved in statecraft in particular, what happens is that the purity of that religion or the clarity of that religion get compromised. So they were never kind of used to an account of Christian hegemony, of Christian kind of mainstream identity. They thought, for example, that under Constantine in the 4th century, the beginnings of making Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, that was one of the greatest missteps in Christian history. So with that background in mind, I think one of the things that's important about the model of civil society that I began to develop there in that first book was that it celebrates minority positions and celebrates diversity and difference. So I would argue, for example, for the disestablishment of the Church of England, which I think creates a level of privilege of one worldview over others, which is actually unhelpful for the Church as well as for other religious groups and non-religious groups as well. In fact, I did a paper on that years and years ago at St George's House in Windsor Castle, which is a very strange place to give a paper. And essentially I had not quite a stand-up row, but it's certainly a fairly engaged discussion with Nigel Biggar at Oxford, who was defending establishment, and I was not. That was enjoyable, I think. To answer your question more directly about other world faiths, one of the things that is most fundamentally important about a commitment to non-violence is a commitment to patient reasoning with others and finding common ground. And that's both within religious traditions, between religious traditions, and between those who are religious and those who are not. That seems to me to be the fundamental practice of civil society.
Got time for one more. Amy.
Hi, Richard. I have a couple of teenage theologians in my house who are deeply committed to debate and generally interested in the subject of theology, but they have a very obvious lack of respect for the Christian doctrine and some of the other religious learnings that they encounter in their studies. Are you finding that emerging new generations of theologians are the same, and how do you keep theology relevant where that lack of respect resulting from experiences similar to yours with Yoda, for example, are becoming increasingly apparent?
Thanks, Amy. Am I finding that there's a lack of respect? I'm not particularly, but I've probably got a self-selecting sample of students who are really interested in what religion is about. I would say it's probably worth always clarifying this. In teaching theology, you never ever assume somebody has a particular faith commitment. In fact, the vast majority of the students that I teach, that we teach, are interested in theology not necessarily because it is something they hold as a personal commitment, but they have discerned, they're aware that either in the past or in the present, religion is an enormously powerful influence in the world. It shapes what we value, how we value it, how we protect it, how we engage in politics with one another. So there's a sense that religion is fundamentally important, even if you don't personally agree with it. But the other thing, and it sounds like you've got some in your household as well, the other thing that I think is more or less universal for every student I teach is they all love a good argument. but they love a good argument. And I think one of the things that we try and inculcate and try and model in academic discourse, not just in theology, but more generally, is how to disagree well, how to be respectful in that, how to be empathetic to a different view. And that's not actually very easy, especially when your immediate reaction to something is that's appalling or that's obviously foolish. So what you have to do at that moment is to stop yourself and say, why is it obvious that that's foolish? And I think in doing that and trying to empathise with a very different view and see where that view has come from, it's one of the ways in which education creates empathy. But that's not to say that you don't then think that there are certain positions, certain views that are wrong, problematic or foolish. The criticality and the empathy are not mutually exclusive. Does that help?
Great, thank you everyone for those questions. I'm sat here thinking, oh, it's a shame Richard's not Prime Minister. So can you join me in thanking Richard? I'm going to exit stage right and get him a gift, but if you can applaud while I do that, that'll be brilliant. Thank you everyone. We're going to do them for drinks.
Thanks everyone.